What makes art good? Is it the mesmerizing eyes that demands your attention? Or something that makes you stop doom scrolling? When I first started learning art around 12 months ago, I thought that key was color. So I spent months trying to fix my artwork by adding even more color. I copied masters, I dropped everything, but somehow my art still looked wrong. This is when I realized I was coloring wrong the entire time. Let me explain what I mean by that. Take a look at a few of my finished drawings. At first glance, the coloring looks fine. There's shading, there are highlights. The color seems to follow the forms and you can easily tell what you're looking at. But the longer you stare at them, the more something felt off. And I couldn't really explain it. I just knew the colors weren't working properly. I tried using an airbrush to add more contrast to the skin. I downloaded hundreds of brushes because I was convinced it was a brush issue. I even tried adding more colors and played with different lighting setups. But every solution I tried ultimately failed. Then I discovered values. The truth is, I've been committing a fatal mistake I didn't even realize I was making. When I convert my art into grayscale and blur it a little, it became hard to tell what I'm actually looking at. The nose and mouth completely disappears. And it's even worse in my full body art. The final nail in the coffin was when I zoomed out. From a distance, my art completely disappears, and that's when it hit me. I was relying on colors to make my art readable instead of values. This made my color look flat because I didn't have enough contrast to make my form readable in the first place. So in order to improve my coloring, I need to learn values first. Before I dive into value studies, I have a confession to make. This is how I used to color. I'm not even joking. If I was doing a master study, I would rely on the eyedropper tool instead of my eyes to replicate the artwork. And yeah, it works. The study looked good, but I wasn't actually learning how to color. I was only pretending to color. When I first started learning about colors, my main goal was to chase results, and the fastest way I knew how to get results was to replicate master studies. Looking at this artwork now, it feels so empty because they weren't my ideas, and the rendering wasn't my decisions. So when it came time to apply these techniques into my own art, my colors completely fell apart. It became painfully obvious when I tried using the eyedropper on real-life images. The color just doesn't work that way. So my first goal with value studies is to break my horrible eyedropper habit. Instead of copying color, I started studying values by painting. The idea here is to find an image to study and try my best to replicate it with values alone. At first, I wanted to pick my own colors. So this image of an egg shouldn't be too bad, right? That was my first mistake. This egg took me over an hour to paint, and it looked nothing like the original. It was actually painful to draw. I was fighting the urge to use the eyedropper the entire time, because the color of my egg just looks completely off. Anyways, this was my first attempt at painting, and it was obvious that I sucked. I kept asking myself, how was an egg supposed to help me with my shading problem? For my next value study, I limited myself to just 3 values and tried replicating this vase in grayscale. By limiting my values, I can focus more on something called forms. Even though I did fundamentals on the head and the body, form is still something I was struggling with, especially this area at the top of the vase. I had a really hard time making my art show depth. And with both of these results, I was feeling out of my element. For the first time in 11.5 months of drawing, I felt completely outclassed by an egg. Was it still too early for me to study values? Or was I somehow studying wrong? To avoid getting discouraged any further, I did something unthinkable. I started drawing random shapes. Yes, you might think I'm crazy, but shapes are kind of like a coping mechanism for me. With shapes, I don't have to think about complicated colors or worry about blending midtones. And this was probably the best decision I made so far. You see, once I returned to painting, something felt different. It was like I flipped a switch and things started clicking. And once I got done painting this bell pepper in both grayscale and color, it made me realize something important. When I put them side by side, the grayscale version had a much better form than the colored one. The green pepper looked longer and more tilted. This made me realize that since I was working with many different colors, I was getting distracted from what I'm actually seeing. The bright green was doing a lot of work for me since it stood out against the background, so the form wasn't as important. In grayscale, I didn't have that luxury. I had to actually make the form readable using light and shadow alone. because I couldn't rely on color to compensate. I had to really think about how to make a bell pepper stand out from the background using these 3 colors, which was a lot harder than I thought. And for the first time since I started painting, I feel like I was beginning to understand why people study values. Anyways, over the next few days, I painted more fruits and vegetables and a cup in both grayscale and color. It felt like I was starting to really get the hang of this. So I celebrated this milestone by painting one of my favorite fruits. I was particularly proud of this artwork because the colors felt actually close to the reference than anything I've ever done before. After painting all those fruits and vegetables, it's time to take this to the next level: humans. Even though I exclusively draw in anime style, it was important for me to study and paint real people because a human's face is much more defined, making it easier and more fundamentally correct to study from. However, there's just one problem. Since I've been exclusively drawing fruits and vegetables, I struggled hard. There's just something way more complicated about a human's face compared to an avocado. And after struggling for a couple of hours trying to fix my horribly painted face, I was pretty much ready to go back to painting fruits, until I got saved by a platform called Skillshare, who were kind enough to sponsor this video. Whether you're a completely new artist or someone close to a year into art like me, Skillshare is the best place to learn a creative skill with classes made just for you. Whether you're looking for a broad topic like how to draw, or a specific skill like what I needed, which was blocking in portraits with values, Skillshare has thousands of creative classes taught by world-class creatives like professional illustrators, renowned graphic designers, and successful entrepreneurs. It's the best place to learn a creative skill or pick up a new hobby. If you're looking to reconnect with your creativity, Skillshare is where humans come to learn from other humans. Also, I believe sharing your art is one of the keys to improving fast. On Skillshare, every class has a section where you can share your art with a community, which can provide valuable feedback to help keep you energized and motivated. By taking a value painting class, I was able to follow a detailed class that guided me through to painting this artwork. A specific detail that I learned in the class was that the lightest value in shadow should never be lighter than the darkest value in light. This helps create a distinction and prevents muddy transitions. This principle will not only help me in creating this art, but will be a valuable rule to keep in mind for the future. This is just one of many details I learned on Skillshare that would have taken me longer to figure out by myself. And with Skillshare's help, I was able to complete this painting. If you are interested and want to give this a try yourself, make sure to take advantage of my unique link in the description or the pinned comment, or scan the QR code on the screen, because the first 500 people that use my link will get a month of Skillshare for free. Get started today. So after painting a bunch of fruits and a portrait, it was finally time to see how much I've learned and can apply to my own art. Before I started drawing my final piece, I wanted to first study how other artists approach coloring and lighting. So I picked an illustration from an artist I really admire, and did a style study based on their work. But there was a catch. Unlike my other style studies from past videos, I would draw a completely different character. That way, I couldn't rely on an eyedropper when it came time to color. The first artwork is from Azuri, and this is the piece we'll be studying from. I picked this illustration because I really wanted to try and draw a pose like this, and I really like how Azuri made the whole composition pop. Drawing this pose was a big challenge because since I've been exclusively painting for a while, I kinda forgot how to sketch and do line art. I'm being dead serious. I had to fix the legs and adjust proportions a couple times before finally settling with this sketch. At this point, I had no idea who I wanted to draw. I could have taken the easy way out and just drawn the character that Azuri drew, but then the study would be pointless because I would fall back into copying colors again. As an artist, deciding on what to draw is probably the most frustrating part of the entire art process. And after a full day of thinking, I finally decided to draw Miko. Since this is a coloring video, I'm not going to go too in depth on the line art, but I did make a couple adjustments like replacing the book with a heart, and also give Miko a different expression. Before I started coloring, I did something I never used to do. I observed. Looking at a reference, the lighting seems to be coming from the top left of the viewer. Being able to tell where the light hit made shading so much easier, because I could clearly separate light and shadow areas. In my past studies, I would usually just copy every color from the source, and hope that with enough repetition, I would eventually be able to render better. And I couldn't be more wrong. No matter how many artworks I finished, when it came time to color my own art, I failed miserably. Thanks to value studies, I'm paying attention to the artist's overall composition, where the lights are hitting, and most importantly, their intent. Why did they shade a certain way? I'm trying to analyze the thought process and not just imitate colors. Anyways, one trick that saved me from a big headache was on Clip Studio Paint, adding a new fill layer, setting it to white, and changing it to color mode. This converts the entire canvas into grayscale, which makes it really easy to check my values. After I finished shading, I adjusted the saturation to better match the mood of Azuri's artwork. Oh, and I also drew a simple background with some cards, which I was pretty proud of. The next art is from Shirohiro. Alright, I definitely don't have ulterior motives here. The reason why I feature my own art is because I'm gonna fix this art of Marin. And let's just say, looking at it now, my colors are really bad. When I turn a piece into grayscale and blur it, the form disappears. There isn't enough contrast between the lights and shadows to clearly define anything. The light source is also confusing because it seems to be coming from the viewer's top right, but there's also areas that stay equally as bright. To fix this, I first colored in grayscale to shape the values, and it helps me develop forms and contrast without the distractions of color. This way, the coloring process will be easier because I did essentially all the hard parts first. Since I was lazy, I just copy and pasted the eyes. Everything was going great, and it feels like I was making a lot of progress, until I ran into a major problem. You see, this area where the light transitioned into the shadow was way too harsh. So I did what I always used to do. I started blending and using a soft airbrush, hoping it would magically fix the sharp transition. And that was a big mistake. This was one of the reasons why my colors are distorted and muddy. I relied way too much on blending instead of properly separating my values. You can see this example clearly in my older work. I went way overboard on blending instead of doing a better job separating the values of the clothes. Anyways, my recoloring ended up like this, which I'm not completely satisfied with, but I did learn a lot doing these two studies, and it's finally time to put everything I've learned so far and see if all those days of boring fruit painting and value studies actually paid off. To find out, I will draw Freerin. Since this is a coloring video, I didn't go too crazy with a full body pose, so I found this pose on Pinterest that I really liked and used it as a reference. Using the knowledge from my face drawing video, I quickly constructed my head. For her elven ears, I actually used a technique I learned recently, which was the coil technique. It's really helped me draw Freerin's pointy ears easily, especially since I never drew ears like these before. Since this was my final piece before making this video, I tried extra hard to make sure this was one of the best faces I've drawn so far, which was why the sketch and line art alone took me over 4 hours. After that, I started my coloring process in grayscale to distinguish between the lights and shadows. Doing this process honestly helped me way more than I initially would have thought. It's kinda like doing a coloring sketch, where I get to check if everything looks right before committing to color. Anyways, this is my grayscales draft. Putting in the flats and detailing the eyes is the same coloring process I've always followed. However, here's where I diverge into something completely different. Instead of shading the face first, I decided I was gonna shade and detail the hair. And to my surprise, this process was way easier than normal. I swapped back and forth between my grayscale and color version to see if everything sticks, and eventually ended up with this. Things were looking like it's gonna be smooth sailing from now, until I got to the face. Shading the face took double the time it took me to do the sketch, line art, eyes, and hair. At first, I was having a lot of trouble figuring out why my lighting for the face wasn't working. I played around with different flat colors, blending lights into shadow, which was a big no-no, and I even went back to grayscale to make sure my forms were working. In the end, I told myself to come back later, and went on to shading the clothes instead. Usually, I struggle more with shading the hair than the face, but after focusing more on the values, I was completely stumped on the part where the face catches the light. Making the transition to shadow look natural was really challenging. Finally, I discovered something that completely solved my problems. The reason why my face rendering was so awkward was because I actually focused too much on lighting instead of the forms. The face isn't flat, so lighting should not be a straight line. Once I unlocked this knowledge and stopped overusing the airbrush, I was able to finally render something I was satisfied with, and she came out like this. I'm pretty speechless looking at my final result. This artwork took me over 18 hours and 72 layers to finish, but I'm proud of what I drew today. Before I learned values, I was just eyedropping colors without a goal in mind, hoping repetition will eventually improve my colors. I was coloring wrong. If you compare this art of Freerin to this art of Subjang I drew a month ago, fruits and vegetables do make a difference. If you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing to the channel and I'll reward you with this delicious avocado.